Welcome. This is Meet NVivo, a look inside mixed methods analysis with NVivo for Windows. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you here today. My name is Stuart Robertson. I'm an NVivo consultant and trainer. I've been working with NVivo for 15 years now, a little bit over 15 years. I came to it during my doctoral work. Actually used NVivo 2 for both my literature review as well as my study. I did a single case study looking at the social and cultural forces that come into play in the creation of an alternative educational environment. Today is our first day introducing our new NVivo suite, the NVivo 12 suite. Comprising of NVivo 12 Pro for Windows, NVivo 12 Plus for Windows, NVivo 12 for Mac, and NVivo for Teams. Today we will be looking at the Windows versions, so the NVivo 12 Pro and Plus, and I'll be using NVivo 12 Plus for today's presentation. NVivo supports a wide range of data from traditional documents, bringing in spreadsheets, looking at audio, video, bibliographic information, PDFs, looking at information coming in from the web. It can work with SurveyMonkey and Qualtrics, and new in NVivo 12, you can actually import and export to SPSS. This is especially helpful for mixed methods projects where you may have some data that would need to be shared between both of those formats, both of those softwares. The qualitative researcher in me needs to contextualize what we will be thinking about or what I was thinking about as I was putting this together. And I used a very general definition that could kind of guide my thinking. So mixed methods research is a type of research in which a researcher or team of researchers combines elements of qualitative and quantitative research approaches, the use of qualitative and quantitative viewpoints, data collection, analysis, inference techniques for a broad purpose of breadth and depth of understanding and corroboration. And for many of us, that is the area that we find ourselves working in current research projects. Today, I want to take a look at some of the tools that are available in NVivo 12. Today's session is designed as an overview to give you a sense of possibilities. It is not designed as a training session per se. We certainly will talk about resources towards the end of the presentation. But today is to highlight some of the key tools that NVivo has that can be of use to those working in a mixed methods methodology. And we'll look at the working with survey data, the coding query, the word frequency query, the matrix coding query. A new feature in NVivo 12 is the crosstab, so we'll be introducing that today. We'll talk about charts and the coding comparison query. When you think about working with information, you want to think about gathering that information, being able to import that information or data into one platform, to be able to explore and analyze that data, and ultimately visualize and share the data that you and the conclusions that you've reached. So let's take a look at NVivo in action. So I'm going to swap here for a moment over into NVivo 12 Plus. And for those of you who are familiar with NVivo 11, initially the welcome screen looks very similar. Today I'll be using NVivo 12 Plus, but I think everything I will be doing will be available in both Pro and Plus. If something is counter to that, I certainly will point that out. For those of you who may not have worked with NVivo before, starting a new project is really quite simple. I can begin a blank project. I'm going to call this Mixed Methods Example. In the standalone NVivo, the file is stored right on your computer. So NVivo will create a .nvp file. Anything that I bring into that file will be placed, anything I bring into that project will be placed in that file. Anything that I work on that I can bring in, can save within the program will be saved there as well. With NVivo 12, there are quick steps to help you get started. This is now video-based as opposed to link-based or text-based as it was in NVivo 11. For those of you who are familiar with NVivo 11, you'll notice that the screen, the workspace, has not changed that much structurally. However, there have been some great changes that will helpful and make it a little bit more user-friendly. For example, the quick access area now allows you to pin project pieces to this area, this space, and be able to access them very quickly. For example, I often will have a node, and we'll talk about what those are in just a couple of minutes. A node where I'll keep my memorable quotes. So I'll pin that to the quick access bar and always have it available, readily available for me to be able to code information. The navigation view now, instead of having buttons or tabs to move to different parts of the software, we now have expandable menus that can allow you to more easily access the different pieces that you may need. Again, for those of you familiar with past versions, we used to have sources, including internals, externals, and such. That's been now replaced with data and files, codes as a section under which you can gather your nodes. And basically a node is a bin where you can gather together pieces of data that match a particular topic, theme, or concept that you're interested in. Cases have been broken out from what used to be the node section so that they have their own section now where we can create cases. These are basically just nodes that are built around units of your analysis. They could be people that you've been interviewing or working with. They could be organizations, places, however you might want to be able to question the data that you've collected. Notes, there's now a note section. Search, there's maps available as well as an output section. At the top, the ribbon, so I work my way up here, has been shortened so that it is much easier to find what you're looking for in the ribbon area. There are now context-specific ribbons that will only appear when you have a particular tool activated. So that, again, makes it that much easier to be able to work with this information. For today, I'm going to actually start off by importing an Excel file that is a survey. Again, I can do this through my ribbon if I wish. I can also come down to my workspace in what would be the list view, and I can import by right-clicking as well. So I'm just going to go out to some sample data that I have and bring in some survey data. One of the features that I like, especially when we're working with survey data like this, is during the import process, NVivo will create cases for you based on each row of your table, which technically would represent each person who has filled out your survey. Closed-ended questions are brought in, and they are created as attributes. So they will be tied to the open-ended responses for each person. And this could be information such as demographic information. It could be information such as Likert or Likert scale information or reactions or answers. Open-ended questions, they will be gathered together and grouped as nodes around the questions that were asked. So it gives me very quickly a number of different ways to be able to look at my data. I'll go ahead and click Next here. I'll be able to review and make sure that I have the correct data that I want to bring in. I'm bringing in the correct worksheet. I can set up where I want the data to be stored, such as my cases. I do need to have one of the fields in the incoming data be a unique identifier for each of my participants. So I respondent as the unique identifier. And survey respondent, I'll use that as the classification. And that is just a place where NVivo will gather together all of the attributes that I want to use for this group of data. I will have the opportunity to decide whether or not I want to import all of the fields. I'll also have the opportunity to review and make sure that my open-ended questions have been correctly identified, as well as my closed-ended. And when I'm ready to go, I can click Next. In our Pro version, NVivo would then begin the import process. In the Plus version, there's actually an algorithm that can be used to auto-code themes, so generate potential themes, and another algorithm that can look at sentiment, can generate potential groupings of statements based around sentiment. Again, those two options are available in the NVivo Plus version. For today's demonstration, I'm just going to import the data. When you first are using this information, if you do use the auto code options, it will download the necessary information into NVivo. And I realized that I left them checked, so it will go ahead and generate those. So it will go through and import the survey, create the cases, create the attributes. And in this option, it will generate potential auto-coding by themes and auto-coding by sentiment. When you do make use of those in the Plus version, once it brings in the data as you see here, it will also go through and generate visualizations for you. So for example, I can look at auto-coded themes around each of the questions from my survey. I can look at compared by number of coding references for those themes that were generated. It shows me 4 levels of uh, sentiment analysis, potential sentiment here, as well as a comparison around the questions of that survey that I brought in. Again, those pieces are available in the Plus and they are optional. If I come back to just my survey data, I now have all of that information inside of my project. I can interact with my open-ended questions just as I would any other type of text-based data. If I come over and I look at my node section and I look at the survey data, this grouping is based on the open-ended questions that were there. So I've had a chance to be able to group those together. If I wanted to see what people said about the water quality down east, I've got the ability to do just that and be able to look across all of those answers for potential themes or trends within that data. With the cases, it has created a case for each of my survey respondents, and inside of their case, it has placed their open-ended responses. New in 12, if I come down to my case classifications and I look at survey respondent, I can very quickly get a chance to see the attribute and attribute values that were assigned to that particular respondent. So these were their open-ended, these were their closed-ended answers. And I can then use those to be able to look at the data that I've brought into my project. For example, I might wish to get a sense of when people discussed the water quality in this area, what were the words that they were using? How did they describe that? For that, I can come up to the Explore tab and make use of a word frequency query. I can look at either all of my data, or if there's something in particular, a selected item, I could then go into my nodes and my survey data here, and I'll take the water quality down east is, and perhaps I'll look at the top 100 words. I'll go ahead and run that query, and I can start to see what words are coming up. If there are words that are being generated that are not helping me, I can always add them to the stop words list. NVivo does have a stop words list. You'll notice that we don't have words like a and the, so they're in a predetermined part of the stop words list. But I can also add additional words, so that if I have words, for example, getting or lot, I can select them, right-click, and add to the stop words list, so that if I rerun this query, those words are removed from the list. A popular visualization in NVivo that is connected with the word frequency is the word cloud, so that I can quickly generate a visual to either help me as the researcher get a better sense of what are my most frequently used words, or to be able to generate visualizations that I can right-click and export. And I can export the word cloud as a bitmap, a JPEG, be able to then bring it into a PowerPoint presentation or put it into a report as I'm looking at those pieces. I can also start to think about looking at my data based on potential subgroupings. In this particular survey example, people were asked a Likert scale question about the pace of development and how they felt about it, with responses such as too fast, about right, too slow, unconcerned. And I may want to be able to look at how did my people who said that the pace of development was too fast, how did they answer the open-ended question, what types of development would I like to see? I may be working under an assumption that my people who said the pace of development was too fast may be anti-development. So that's where I can, again, turn to my queries and be able to look at my coding query and be able to say, I want to see everything coded at any selected codes or cases, and I will choose from my nodes here, my survey data, the type of development I would like to see. And I can add an additional criteria here, coded at any case where. And I can say under my survey respondents, I can take the Likert scale pace of development. And I have a number of comparisons depending on the types of data I have there. I'll go with equals value, too fast. I'll go ahead and run the query. And if my initial thought was that people who said the pace of development was too fast would be anti-development, it shows from the responses to this particular open-ended question that that belief was off base. That's really not the case, that the overwhelming majority are not anti-development, but are very specific about the type of development they want to see. So when you start thinking about the power of tools like this to be able to get into your data and to be able to quickly start seeing patterns or trends, it certainly is a very powerful tool. Let me go ahead. I'm going to close some of my open tabs here because I also want to show you that you can do a lot more, do very traditional type of work with qualitative data. So for example, under my files here, I'm going to create a new folder and bring in some interviews. And again, I'll go up to import. And in this case, I'll bring in under data, I'll bring in files. So I'll go back to some interviews that I have. And I'm just going to bring in 3 quick interviews here. And once I've brought them in, what NVivo does is it creates a copy of each of those interviews, places the copy inside of my my project so that if I accidentally delete something, move things around, I'm not going to negatively impact my original sources. And with this, I can start to think about the coding process I can create nodes ahead of time. So if I know that there are certain topics I want to be able to identify within my data, I can create a node. Maybe family is a topic that I'm interested in. I can create a node, and as I'm looking at the sources here, if I see something that speaks to that, I can highlight that data and be able to drag and drop it right into the node. In the node itself, what NVivo does is it organizes it by source, lets me know how many references I have from this source at this node, and what percentage of that source is represented here. So right now, this little piece is less than 0.5% of the whole interview. So I know it's a very small piece right now. Then I'll be able to look at the references themselves, and they will appear in the sequence that they appear within the original source. So it doesn't matter in what order I go through the coding process. NVivo will organize it sequentially when I bring it in here by the source itself. Again, I'm always tied back to the original source so that I can see that particular piece in its original context. If I am going forward, let me turn off the highlight here for a moment. Let's say that I'm doing something a little bit more emergent. I certainly can interact with my data. And if I find an emerging topic, I can select the data itself. I'll drag and drop it over to the nodes area here in the open space. And NVivo will prompt me to create a new node. And that way I can begin to create nodes. And even here I can keep track of the number of files that are represented, the number of references I have in looking at some of these topics as I move forward. One of the pieces I did want to show that's new in NVivo 12 in the Pro and the Plus edition is the ability to be able to take transcripts such as this, or maybe it's a focus group transcript, to be able to select those, and under the Home tab to be able to use a new autocode feature called speaker name. So this will allow me to identify the speakers that I have. Although some people, as you may know, that you could use heading styles to achieve a similar outcome. Now you can actually use the name itself. So I'll put in Henry here is one of the ones that I know. Barbara. So that when I'm looking at Henry and Barbara's interview here, I can separate them out with Charles. Charles and Linda was the interviewer. And finally, if I take a look at Dorothy, Henry's already on the list, so he's been noted. So now I can just add Dorothy. And I'll go ahead and click Next. And I can create a new classification here. So I'm going to say interview participant. And I'll put them in, I can put them in the cases if I wish, or I can create a new folder. And I'll click Finish. If I come down to my cases, I now have a case for each of my speakers. And if I know that Henry and Linda were my interviewers, I can be able to delete them so that if I wanted to do, say, a word frequency, I could do it on just my participants' words. If I'm doing a focus group, I could then add attributes to these participants to be able to see what my male and female participants said, or certain socioeconomic backgrounds, whatever is pertinent to the questions that I'm asking. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and close this sample project that I've been working with and open up the more mature version of it. It's the sample project that comes with NVivo, and use that to demonstrate some of the other tools that may be of assistance. For example, I may want to be able to look across my data. Perhaps I've coded for different aspects of the natural environment in this particular sample. And I might want to look across those based on age group. One option I have, if I'm interested particularly in the content, is the matrix coding query, so that I can create a row for each of my age groups. So I'll do selected items here, and I'll look at my case classifications. And under person, I can open up my age groups and select those that I'd like to quickly take a look at. In my columns, I can add the different topics or the coding that I want to look across. So in this case, I will select some of my natural environment pieces. And when I run this, NVivo quickly shows me the number of initially references that I have from each age group at each of these topics. For those of you who might have used earlier versions, you might remember that you can also shade. Shading used to be a drop-down menu. Shading is now built into the ribbon so that I can very quickly get a sense of where my peaks and valleys are along this particular grouping. And as with any of my matrices, I can double click on a cell and be able to see the information behind the number. And I have to say, for myself as a qualitative researcher, this was really important to me because I never wanted to be separated from my data. I always wanted to be able to get back and see my data within its context. Again, as I'm looking at this, I can also see the matrix tab that you see up here, and this is one of those context-specific pieces, ribbons that I was referring to early on in the presentation. Sometimes, though, I may want to go beyond, and from a mixed methods perspective, I may wish to get more of a summative view so I can see the breakdown across these topics. And for that, I now have under the Explore and Queries, I have a crosstab. And the crosstab allows me to crosstab codes against attributes or cases, whatever is pertinent to the work that I'm doing. So if I wanted to see, instead of a breakdown of references, I wanted to see a breakdown of participants, I can create a crosstabs. I can go in and define the codes. So I'll go to my nodes folder here. And let me move this over so it's a little bit easier to see. Natural environment. And I can drag and drop them into the code area here. For the attributes, I can see what classifications I've created. So under person, I wanted to look at age groups. If I want to include unassigned and not applicable, I simply have to click here. Most of the time, though, I really want to focus on what has been identified. So I'll go ahead and just run this query. And now as I'm looking at it, again, let me throw up some shading here. At the top, I now have the age group and the total number of participants in that age group. I have the breakdown of how many participants from there have been coded to a particular topic. And at the bottom, I have the total unique participants from this group that have been that have commented across these particular topics. If I continue heading down to the end, I have totals for the rows as well. It will also generate a chart so that if I want to be able to look at a more visual representation, I've got the ability to do just that. And again, I do have 2 or 3 different options that I can look at to be able to generate and export this chart if I'd like to be able to use it in a presentation. One of the nice things now with the crosstabs that it's easier to do is if you wish to break down the information by a second attribute. So in this example, I'm looking at age group, but I might want to then break the age groups down based on gender. And I can simply add gender and rerun the query. And now I have the summation for my total in the age group and then a breakdown by gender. So for those of you who are working in the mixed methods methodologies, to be able to now have this tool right in NVivo itself certainly can be of great assistance in making the most out of the understanding of your data. And should I want to save these results, I can save those results. I'll just call this age group and gender. I can store them within my project itself, or if I wish, I can export this under the Share tab. I can export this piece as an Excel sheet, text file, or as I was mentioning earlier, I can save it as an SPSS data file. So I now have that option as well. So again, very powerful tools to help me make the most of the data that I have and to be able to keep my focus on making sense of the data, bringing meaning to the data as I'm looking at those pieces. One of the other tools that I wanted to mention is the idea of being able to do coding comparisons. Oftentimes you may be having coding done by two different coders, and I can use the under the Explore tab, I can use the coding comparison query to compare the coding of two coders or two groups of coders. So in this sample project, I'll select one of the coders, Effie Reeves here, and compare the coding, her coding to that of Wanda's. And I'll, instead of doing all the nodes, I actually have set aside selected nodes, or actually codes and cases in a selected set. I've actually created a set that would allow me to make sure that if I ran this with different pairings, I would use the same nodes each and every time. So I'll use the nodes for coding comparison. I'll look at files, externals, and memos in selected sets, making sure that I'm looking at the correct sources, because we may not have coded all of the sources, but simply selected sampling to do the comparison on. And I'll do interviews for coding comparison. I can display a kappa coefficient for each source at each node that I've selected. I can also display a percentage agreement or disagreement if I wish. So let me go ahead, I'll run this. And NVivo generates a chart for me so that I can see at each of the topics, each of the sources, and be able to see the kappa coefficient for inter-rater reliability, or be able to look at the percentage agreement overall, and then broken down by what percentage of the source did both A and B code the same, what percentage of the source did A and B both choose not to code. Sometimes we forget that choosing not to code something is still a choice. If I look at disagreement, what percentage was coded by A but not B, and what percentage was coded by B and not A. So this is a nice overview to give me a sense of where there may be some problem areas that we want to take a look at together. If I want to go back into the data, if there's something that I'd like to follow up on, so for example, I'll come up to here, and I can double click on a row. NVivo will open up the source for me and turn on the coding stripes. And I'll be able to visually see what the whole team, there might be additional people, what the whole team has coded, and then initially comparing Effie and Wanda to see where one might have coded but the other did not. As I'm going through this, I can also, from this particular view, if I see that there may be other places where other team members might have coded, I can also right-click on my coding stripes, and I can show substripes for additional team members. So even though I am limited to two coders or two groups of coders, when it comes to the initial structure, the initial coding comparison, once I get into this view, I have a little bit more flexibility to visually look at what's happening within the data itself. All right, let me step out of NVivo here for a moment and step back in to share a little bit more information with you. Um, there are a number of licensing options from the trial version, 14-day free trial of the full working version, to student licenses, full licenses, enterprise license agreements that you have available, ways that you can begin working with NVivo. There's a lot of help in getting started, customer support and resources. The welcome to NVivo video that was prompted when we first went in, the getting started tutorials, free educational webinars, such as this one, for example. We also have others where guest speakers will come in and talk about how they've used it. Right on the welcome screen, you have frequently asked questions, the FAQs you can head out to. The NVivo help menu, accessible right from within NVivo, has some excellent guidance in how to use certain tools to be able to set up certain features within NVivo itself. There are online communities, including a user forum on the QSR website at www.qsrinternational.com, where people from all over the world are asking questions, sharing answers, giving suggestions. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, there is a 14-day free trial to help you go ahead and get started. I do want to thank you so much for being with me. I do hope the presentation was helpful, gave you some thoughts or possibilities using NVivo and mixed methods, and hopefully I'll get a chance to work with some of you again in some of our future Meet NVivo sessions. So have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day, and take care, everyone.